Committee will come to order. This morning, I'm pleased to welcome Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein to review the Air Force budget request for 2020. Secretary Wilson, congratulations on being named the sole finalist, in other words, the next president of the University of Texas, El Paso. We appreciate your participation here today. We also appreciate your service as a congressman, as Rhodes Scholar, everything that goes with it. And you've had the complete package, and you're going to continue doing things, I know, for the country. We'll hear from you again in other capacities. The Air Force budget request for 2020 is $165.6 billion, an increase of $9.8 billion over the amounts enacted in 2019. And while we're here today to focus on the budget request, we're also interested in hearing about how the Air Force is executing its 2019 funds, which we thought were pretty robust but needed. The National Defense Strategy Commission recently stated that the Air Force will be at the forefront of the next conflict, regardless of where it occurs or which adversary it features. That's strong stuff. I think they're correct in that assessment. The country expects that the Air Force will invest in a lethal force that will be able to confront our adversaries of the future, and it cannot fail to maintain a ready force today. This committee will scrutinize the budget request that we received to ensure that it supports the more than 20,000 airmen deployed around the globe at 180 locations, and that it adequately addresses the long-term challenges posed to us by China and Russia. Today, we look forward to understanding how your 2020 budget request reflects the priorities, your priorities, to include the creation of the Space Force, the addition of operational squadrons, and what types of aircraft comprise those squadrons, the modernization of our nuclear capabilities, and further development of hypersonic weapons. Secretary Wilson, General, we appreciate your service to the country. We look forward to hearing from you. And now I'll turn to Senator Durbin.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Secretary and General Goldfein, thank you for being with us today. And I just learned as I sat down here about the next step in your career. I wish you the very best, whatever your final decision may be. You brought real skill and dedication to your job as Secretary of the Air Force, and you have overcome whatever is left of House careers that both of us brought to our next endeavor and made the very, very best of it. Let me tell you that I believe that we are facing a critical budget cycle. We do not want to return to sequestration. I don't believe that is healthy for this nation, certainly not for our defense. But I also have to quickly add that I don't believe dreaming up $174 billion in OCO funds is the answer. I believe that that is short-sighted, both in terms of our deficit and in terms of our budgeting. If there is someone in the administration who believes that we can dramatically shortchange non-defense spending and look the other way at $174 billion in OCO, they just didn't look at the results of the last election. We need a bipartisan answer to the future of this budget process, one that serves our nation and one that serves our national defense. I won't go into a long riff about the wall and what it might involve. I'm sure that that'll be discussed at length in many other different places. I would also raise a question about the whole concept of the Space Force. This, to me, is an idea that needs to be thoroughly vetted and carefully reviewed before we stand up another branch of our military. Is this in the best interest of America's national defense? Is it going to necessarily involve an investment in bureaucracy, which comes with it, which may be uncontrollable? The late John McCain spoke up many times about the possibility that we're putting more people in the Pentagon than we are in the field. We need to make sure that whatever we are doing, we're consciously avoiding overspending where it's unnecessary and consciously spending taxpayers' dollars in the name of national defense in a thoughtful way. So I look forward to that conversation. Thank you for being here.
Secretary Wilson, yours and the General's opening statement will be made part of the record in its entirety. You proceed as you wish. Welcome again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the opening statement in Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the opening statement in the record, I'll just summarize a few points, if I might. The Air Force budget proposal that we've put forward is driven by the National Defense Strategy and the priority missions set out in that strategy. I'd highlight probably three major things for you and then answer any questions that you might have of us. The first is that this budget focuses on building a more lethal and ready Air Force. We are more ready for combat operations today than we were 2 years ago. Readiness, first and foremost, is about people and their training. We have closed the gap on the maintainer shortage that we faced 2 years ago when we were 4,000 maintainers short, and now we have to season those young airmen and make them into masters of their craft. The fiscal year 20 budget continues the steady increase in end strength with an addition of 4,400 personnel. It also adds in funds to hire more civilians, particularly focused on depot-level maintenance to make sure that our equipment is in condition to be able to fight. And we have stopped the decline in the number of pilots and increased funds for the training of those pilots. With respect to readiness of our equipment, we are modernizing across the board with the F-35, the KC-46, the B-21 bomber, the nuclear deterrent, the TX trainer, and of course our helicopters. So we have modernization going on across the board. It has to be cost-effective modernization, but tomorrow's modernization, or today's modernization, results in tomorrow's improvements in readiness. So the first thing, again, we're doing is building that more lethal and ready force. We are also trying to field tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter, taking advantage of the authorities that the Congress has given us in 2016 and 2017 to improve Air Force acquisition. We cannot win this contest against a near-peer adversary with an acquisition system from the Cold War. And so we are speeding up the way in which we do things. Delegating authority to the services works. We have more control over our major programs, and we are taking advantage of the new authorities to prototype and experiment which you have given us. Last week, we had our inaugural pitch day in New York City. We did this both to engage small, innovative companies, but also to change the way the Air Force does business with those companies. And we ended up contracting in a single day with 51 companies. The average time for contract award was 15 minutes, and the length of the contract was 1 page. We are fielding tomorrow's Air Force faster and smarter. The third thing I would highlight is that our fiscal year 20 budget builds on our advances made in fiscal year 19 and further accelerates our ability to operate in space. There's a 17% increase in space funding over FY19. It's for about a $14 billion unclassified space program. The Department of Defense recently submitted legislation to establish the Space Force as a new service within the Department of the Air Force. This proposal capitalizes on the Air Force being the best in the world at space, and given the new era of strategic competition, it is a move that would posture us for the future. In closing, this budget includes funds with an emergency clause for Tyndall Air Force Base. And I would ask that, Mr. Chairman, I know you're looking at and trying to craft a supplemental to deal with some of these terrible storms that have hit the southeastern part of the United States. We look forward to working with you on that because that supplemental will be vital to recovery of Tyndall Air Force Base. Yes, sir. Tyndall Air Force Base recovery. And finally, thank all of you for the certainty that you have provided us in fiscal year 19. We started out this year with a budget at the beginning of the year. And at the end of the first quarter, we looked at the financials and we had executed about a quarter of our program in the first quarter of the year. Sequestration would erase all of the gains that we have made together over this last 3 years. And we look forward to working with all of you to make sure that that doesn't happen. The Air Force will compete, deter, and win. That's our job, and we look forward to working with you to make sure that that continues to be the way the Air Force does business. Thank you, sir. Chief?
General Goldfein.
Chairman Shelby, Ranking Member Durbin, and distinguished members of the committee, what an honor it is to once again represent your airmen. 685,000 active guard, reserve, and civilians who stand the watch and provide top cover for the nation and our joint and allied teammates. This hearing is the first public gathering since Secretary Wilson announced her pending departure from the Air Force. And I want to say publicly, on behalf of all airmen and their families, what an honor it's been to work with her every day to make our Air Force more lethal and more ready. These past 2 years have been the most rewarding of my career, and this budget reflects the culmination of our work together to build the Air Force we need to compete, to deter, and to deterrence fails, to fight and win. And I want to state for the record that we're a better Air Force because of the leadership and the vision of our Secretary, Dr. Heather Wilson.
Thanks, Chief.
Chairman, I went to war for the first time as a young captain, flying F-16s out of Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, just a few days after Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor in Kuwait. We were the second squadron of 34 that deployed forward out of 134 fighter squadrons in the inventory. At that time, we had 401 operational squadrons and 945,000 active guard, reserve, and civilian airmen in the Air Force that formed the fist the nation needed. 401 operational squadrons to defeat a middleweight, non-nuclear power who threatened his neighbor and the region, but posed little threat to our homeland and our way of life. Today we have 312 operational squadrons, down from 401. We have just 55 squadrons of fighters, down from 134. And we have 685,000 airmen, down from 945,000. We are not the Air Force of Desert Storm. Yet, as articulated in the National Defense Strategy, today we face a significantly different global security environment. China and Russia are nuclear powers, and Russia continues to violate treaties as it rebuilds and grows its nuclear capacity and capability. When my predecessor, General Tony McPeak, was the chief in 1991, he and his fellow Joint Chiefs were focused on supporting a single combatant commander, General Norm Schwarzkopf, the commander of U.S. Central Command. Today, should deterrence fail and we find ourselves defending our nation against a major power, as the chief, Secretary Wilson and I will be simultaneously supporting at least 3 combatant commanders who will be simultaneously asking for air, space, and cyber power. First, the Geographic Combatant Commander will request forces to support his campaign, which may include backfill for the fighters, tankers, and command and control forces he'll place on nuclear alert, given his role as the Supreme Allied Commander of a nuclear alliance. The next call I expect to receive will be from U.S. Strategic Command. And he'll tell me how many bombers, tankers, and command and control forces he'll need to execute his nuclear deterrence plan for protecting not only the homeland, but also our allies and partners. And the third call will be from Northern Command. Will tell me how many fighters, tankers, ISR, and C-2 aircraft he'll need to execute his plan to defend the homeland. And the Air Force will be asked to support these missions simultaneously, not sequentially, while at the same time maintaining a global presence to deter any rogue nation who might take advantage of our situation as we simultaneously maintain campaign pressure on violent extremism. This is the stark difference between fighting a middleweight rogue nation without nuclear weapons versus competing, deterring, and if deterrence fails, fighting and winning a peer fight. It's why Secretary Wilson and I continue to articulate in every forum that the Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking us to do. And it's why, as you said, Chairman, the National Defense Strategy Commission stated, regardless of where the next conflict occurs or which adversary it features, the Air Force will be at the forefront. With your support of this budget request, will continue to rebuild the readiness and lethality of the Air Force, which you supported last year with an on-time appropriation following a damaging sequester and years of budget uncertainty, all while the Air Force executed continuous combat operations. Sir, history doesn't always repeat, but it does rhyme now and then. My father fought as a young F-4 pilot in Vietnam, and he and many of his peers stayed in and rebuilt the Air Force his son needed to fight and win in Desert Storm. My daughter and my nephew are young airmen today. And with your support, we'll rebuild the Air Force they need to fight and win in this era of great power competition. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson, the 2020 President's budget request includes $718 billion for the Department of Defense. But to comply with the Budget Control Act, the Department has requested a large amount for the Overseas Contingency Operation, OCO. In your written statement, you say that the Air Force cannot fully implement the National Defense Strategy with a constrained budget. I think that's a given. How would sequestration spending levels impact your current operations and your efforts to restore readiness and modernization your weapons systems? Be specific as you can in this open hearing.
Mr. Chairman, our adversaries around the world have not done as much to damage the United States Air Force as sequester did. And going through sequester again would be devastating to this force. It would undermine the advances that we've made in the last 3 years. And just to even go back to look at what happened when it happened before, it basically meant pretty much the grounding of about a third of the Air Force. There was 1 million hours of maintenance that didn't get done in our depots, and we are still digging out from under the impact of sequester. If we did it again, the cuts would be deeper, and the impact would be more lasting.
General Goldfein, the 2019 Defense Appropriations Act included additional funding to accelerate and to bolster several areas prioritized in the National Defense Strategy, including hypersonic weapons, microelectronics, and test evaluation infrastructure. We understand a lot of that's difficult to talk about in this setting today, but what could you tell us in an open hearing that what you're doing with that?
Sir, I'll start, and the Secretary, I know, has been very active with her fellow secretaries on working together across the services on these issues, especially in the business of hypersonics. So we have investment in this budget in next generation of air dominance. We have investment in this budget in networking the future of warfare to ensure that every sensor and every shooter are connected, and that it brings our asymmetric advantage to the fight so we can produce multiple dilemmas for an adversary. It has money in this budget to work on directed energy, and it has money that we in this budget that takes us from a purely defensive posture in space to also bringing offensive capability. And I'll turn it over to the Secretary on hypersonics.
Mr. Chairman, I think hypersonics is a good example of where we are doing things faster and smarter by working together with the other services. The 3 service secretaries get together quite often. One of our first meetings, we decided to sign a memorandum of understanding on hypersonics. The Navy had funded the test of a warhead on an Army system with an Army shell that worked pretty well. But the Air Force had better rockets. So what we're doing for a hypersonics program is we are testing the Army shell, or the outside of the system, with Air Force rockets, and we're designing this with all 3 services involved so that it could be dropped off of an aircraft, launched from the ground, or launched from the deck of a ship. By doing this jointly and using best technology, going fast, learning from each other, we've accelerated the deployment of a hypersonic weapon by 5 years.
And you're eliminating some stovepipes there that
Yes, sir,
we don't need, do we? Secretary Wilson, the KC-46 tankers. We understand that the Air Force has accepted the first KC-46 tankers earlier this year, but 2 deficiencies, I understand, remain outstanding. What's the Air Force plan to resolve these, dealing with the provider, and ultimately recapitalize the aging tanker fleet, because the tankers are very important to project force, as you know?
Mr. Chairman, our budget includes purchase of the next, I think it's 12 KC-46 tankers in FY20. We have accepted the first tankers and brought them into both Oklahoma and Kansas. There are two critical deficiencies that we're working on. One had to do with the stiffness of the boom for light aircraft, and particularly the A-10, which is a very light aircraft. The boom actually met international standards, so it met the standards, and that is actually the first change on this program that the Air Force has requested is a redesign of one of the actuators on that boom so that it can accept light aircraft. That was at our expense. The remote vision system has some issues with it in the acuity of the system, and the Air Force and Boeing have reached agreement on what the technical parameters have to be for that fix, and it will be done at Boeing's expense.
You think that's going to be worked out in the next year?
They are working on the technical design now. It won't actually be all back into all the systems for probably 3 years.
Key to refueling, isn't it, General?
Yes, sir. And I'll tell you that having been a receiver of getting fuels in some really bad places around the world, I went out and flew the airplane and put it through the ringer. And there were 4 criteria I was looking at. Number 1, how does it fly? Number 2, how does it communicate? Number 3, how does it defend itself? And then 4, how does it tank? Because we bought a commercial stock 767 aircraft, we got a lot of great capability when it comes to how it flies. And what I was very interested in is how stable it is for receivers. Its ability to communicate. What I'm perhaps most excited about as we look at networked warfare of the future is the fact that there are 13 additional stations where we can place communications nodes in the future to take full advantage of that capability. When it comes to defending itself, it has defensive capabilities that don't exist on the KC-10 and the KC-135. And then the last issue is what the Secretary talked about, which is its ability to tank. And those areas that they're working on, I mean, we're tough customers, and we didn't accept a single airplane until the company agreed to fix the deficiencies that they had, and we're going to continue to be tough customers and hold them to account.
But it's imperative that the system work for the warfighter, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, if I could add, while there is a deficiency in the remote vision system, it's one that we are working around, and where the warfighters said, you know, if we go to war next week, we want to have this in our hands, not sitting on the ramp, because it actually tanks. It's better than our current tankers when it's hardest to tank at night in bad weather without lights out. It's hardest in bright sunlight, which is when it's easiest to tank.
Madam Secretary, Senator Durbin already touched on this a little bit in his opening statement, Space Force. The Department of Defense has submitted a legislative proposal that will go to the Armed Services Committee, concurrent with the President's budget request for 2020 to begin the establishment of the U.S. Space Force as a separate military service within the Department of the Air Force. Can you explain the reasoning behind the change, in particular the need to address current and future space threats? And what does this do to the Air Force? Is this important to do? A lot of people believe that the Air Force is space. You know, it's about space. You want to get into that a little bit?
Mr. Chairman, the United
Maybe you don't want to, but go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, the United States is the best in the world at space, and our adversaries know it. And they are seeking to develop the capabilities to deny us the use of space in crisis or in war. This year, we are standing up a combatant command to be able to fight and win in space. And we had a combatant command before 9/11. And that will help us, I think, change back to a warfighting mentality in space and recognize the threats that are emerging. We also, and you all also, have approved significant changes in programs based on the threat and the strategy that we put forward in fiscal year 19. And we're asking for another boost in fiscal year 20, a 17% increase in the space budget. American policy is to maintain American dominance in space so that space capabilities are available to the joint war fighter, and so that we deter an attack. We have developed the strategies in order to implement that. The organizational change put forward in the President's proposal elevates and enhances the influence of space leaders in the Pentagon for the long haul. And it is, I think, all of these things taken together are the right move for the country. There is a risk always that, I'm particularly interested in space, have been and spent probably about a third of my time on space-related matters because of the emerging threat. You never know whether that's going to be sustained over time. And I think one of the fears, and it's probably a legitimate fear, is that organizationally, space is smaller than its significance within the Pentagon bureaucracy. And I think that's something that we should consider and as we evaluate the President's proposal, that this will elevate and institutionalize space as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and with an undersecretary in the United States Air Force.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on that because last year I kept hearing this conversation about a Space Force and the satellites, and I thought to myself, I don't know enough about this. I went and had a classified briefing, and I invite all the members of the committee here, and I hope that I'd be glad to return and do it again.
Maybe we need another one.
It was a fascinating moment to understand exactly what we rely on in space when it comes to satellites and their vulnerability. The things that we've come to take for granted in our lives, global positioning, weather, on and on, where satellites play a critical role, and we are vulnerable. As the Secretary has said, they are not just targets, they can be weapons, but at the same time, they can be vulnerable in times of conflict. And the basic question we have to ask is whether or not this is part of the Air Force that needs to be somehow separated, as the Marine Corps is separated within the Secretary of the Navy's jurisdiction. Can you help me, Madam Secretary, understand by perspective the numbers we're talking about? How many civilian and military personnel are part of the Air Force today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start out with equipment. We have 80 satellites. The United States Air Force operates 80 satellites. 80. The Navy has 13 more and a communications satellite system called MUOS that they operate. Of those 80, 31 are GPS. So most people don't know this, but the blue dot on your phone is provided by the United States Air Force, by a squadron of 40 airmen in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Average age 22, which is just terrifying to all of us. So we provide GPS to the world. Satellite communications we do for the Joint Force, weather, as you mentioned, as well as missile warning. We have 8 missile warning satellites. So if you see on the television the launch of a missile from some rogue state, and you see the arch of that missile launch, we initially detect that and then detect where it's going from space sensors. So that's what we do. It involves about 15,000 people total, Army, Navy, Air Force. About 90% of those currently are United States Air Force.
And in the Air Force itself, how many civilian and military employees? I'm told it's over 800,000.
685,000.
Military. And then there's civilian. And civilian, 685,000.
Active Guard Reserve and civilian.
So 685,000, your complement of military and civilian in the Air Force, and about 15,000, you think, in terms of those who are directly responsible for the Space Force responsibility we've discussed.
Yes, sir.
Is that about right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and I might say to my colleagues here, what we're talking about is creating a bureaucracy, let's be very blunt about it, a bureaucracy to command these 15,000 people within the Air Force. What does that mean? I mean, how many generals are we talking about? 3 stars, 1 stars? How much brass do we have to create under this proposal?
Mr. Chairman, the legislative proposal does say that there will be a chief of staff for the Space Force, and the remainder of what the structure is is really left as a lot of wide discretion from the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Air Force. I think it's reasonable to presume that if you're going to have a 4-star, you have to have a certain number of 4 and 3 and 2 and 1 stars underneath it in order to support the.
Can you give me any kind of idea of what we're talking about in terms of the bureaucracy that needs to be created on top of what we currently have?
Sir, I'll tell you that we were in a robust debate, as you might imagine, within the department to get after the president's guidance. And we were debating everything from the initial guidance, which was separate secretary, separate department, all the way to a sort of a JAG Corps, medical corps. Where we landed, which is a separate service within the Department of the Air Force, is recognizable from a warfighting standpoint. As soon as that decision was made, which is just prior to the legislative proposal being issued to or given to Congress, we put together, directed by the secretary, acting secretary, a planning team led by a 2-star general that's now working through all of the details associated with the questions you're asking. How many generals, how many people, where will they reside? And that planning team has been up and operating now for a few weeks.
I say to my colleagues, think about this. Think about what we're being asked to do to create this new bureaucracy, over 15,000 people who are doing, I think most of us would agree, an extraordinary job already. We're told that the bureaucracy that we would create will cost $2 billion over the next 5 years. And it's just an estimate, as General Goldfein has said. There are experts that are looking carefully at this. But we ought to be asking ourselves, are we just dazzled by this notion of a Space Force? Is this going to make us safer? Would $2 billion spent on new equipment, better equipment, more training for those who operate the equipment be a better investment in national defense than a, quote, Space Force? We have the responsibility, along with the Armed Services Committee, to ask that question. If the late John McCain were here, I think I know his answer to it. He basically pushed back against the creation of brass and bureaucracy, saying, let's put it into the capabilities and readiness of the people who are serving our nation already. So I don't want to rain on this Space Force parade, but I do think we ought to have a cold day of reckoning here in terms of whether this is something which we will come to regret when we look at a bureaucracy which may be rivaling the number of people it's supposed to be serving.
Well, Senator Durbin, before I call him Senator Moran, he's asking some serious questions here. Ultimately, the Armed Services Committee will first work on this, but ultimately we're going to have to fund it or not fund it, right here in this committee. Senator Moran.
Shelby, thank you very much. General, thank you for your presence. Heather, Secretary, it's an honor to have you in front of us once again. I knew when I met you, we were classmates in 1996, arriving in the House of Representatives, that someday you'd be president, and now it's apparently coming true, so congratulations. Secretary, you indicated in your testimony before this subcommittee last year 5 key changes to confront the reemergence of great power competition in support of our national defense strategy, and among those 5 was light attack aircraft. Your goal, which you've reiterated many times, was, quote, fielding a force of U.S. light attack aircraft by using, quote, rapid fielding and rapid procurement strategies. And you highlighted in your comments today about the rapidity of the ability to now for the Air Force to contract. For several years, light attack aircraft has served as the sort, in my mind, of the proof of concept as to whether the Air Force could use the tools that you've been given to field a force of U.S. light attack aircraft. Those tools are rapid acquisition authority that Congress provided you, ample funding provided by the Appropriations Committee for testing and experimentation on 2 turboprop platforms that you selected, the industry partners' investment of their own capital to help the Air Force meet requirements during this multi-year experiment process. When the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation released a report just last December, 4 months ago, indicating the Air Force, quote, intends to procure 359 aircraft for 8 operational squadrons and 3 flying training units. I thought that the rapid acquisition process with industry partners worked for our warfighters and for our allies, and that the light attack was proof that this process can work. However, it appears to me that there is no request for dollars for procurement in this budget. And it seems to me that there is a schizophrenia at the Air Force about light attack. The messages are mixed. And I am hoping that you will be able to tell me that you expect or are requesting something more than additional study, dollars for experimentation, and that we're ready to move forward with the right light attack aircraft procurement process. Is there such a request?
Senator, I'll take that and then turn it over to the Secretary for any added comments. You correctly stated that this is all about supporting the national defense strategy, and it's important to talk about the strategy against violent extremism and then how we use the authorities you gave us to get at experimentation and prototype directly in support of that strategy. The long-term strategy against violent extremism is to drive violence down to the point where it can be managed within the borders of governed nations. And so what we did was we looked at 3 core principles when we started this experiment. And the core principles was, number one, this is about allies and partners. This is about how do we get more allies and partners in with us, because my international air chiefs tell me, I've got violence, I'm dealing with it inside my borders, I can't afford an F-16, I'm not going to get an F-35, I need something, and it's got to be interoperable so that we can join you in this fight. And this is a fight from the Philippines to Nigeria into the Central and South America, so this needs to be about allies and partners. The second core principle is this needs to be a mix of capabilities that are interoperable, because some of the air chiefs tell me I need a turboprop, some of them tell me I need a turbojet, some of them want rotary wings, some of them want manned and unmanned. What ties it all together is an intelligence gathering and information sharing network that allows them to be interoperable with us and with each other. And the third core principle is that we, from the beginning, said this has to be additive. There is no area across the United States Air Force that we can trade for this, because we're doing this directly in support of the strategy. So we took the authorities that you gave us to work through this experiment, and the 2 companies that joined us have been spectacular. We put money towards it, they put money towards it. But when we got to the end of the experiment period, the question we had was, do we have the strategy right? Do we have the interoperability right to be able to put forward a request for a proposal to be able to get the allies and strategy and the allies and partners where we need to be? And our determination was that we were not there yet. So what you'll see in this budget is money that we are going to use to procure a small number of aircraft from the 2 companies that have been with us so far. We're going to place a detachment of those at Nellis Air Force Base, where we do conventional training, and a detachment of those where we do special operations at Hurlburt. The United States Marine Corps has already said they're joining us. We're going to invite allies and partners, and with the authorities you've given us, now that we own those prototypes, we will continue to experiment to build the interoperable network that we have already advanced and get allies and partners and bring more capabilities to bear so that when we get to 22 through 24, which is where we've laid procurement money in, we'll be able to make a smarter acquisition decision. And when you compare what we've done compared to a normal timeline for acquisition that would take 5 to 10 years, we're 2 years into this, and the companies that have been with us have been spectacular, and we look forward to procuring a small number and taking it to the next step.
What are those numbers, both aircraft numbers and dollar numbers?
The money that we have laid is $35 million in 19. There's, I believe, $400 million in 22 through 24 for procurement. How much and what we buy depends on how the experiment goes, and we're hoping that we'll get a low cost point for the ones we want to buy this year with the 19 money, so we can advance the experiment.
I would highlight, General, the importance of those turboprops for our allies.
Absolutely.
The simplicity, our ability to fulfill this mission with their assistance, or
Yes, sir.
us providing them assistance, is related to the type of aircraft that is purchased.
There's only one thing that I would add to General Goldfein's comments, and that is one other thing we're doing this year is getting one of the industry groups to really do a good global market analysis for what is the demand out there for different kinds of aircraft, manned, unmanned, helicopters, turboprop, in some cases turbojet. We know that there are countries with F-5s that want to get rid of those, so that we really understand what the allies want, so that what we do enables them to be able to buy something similar.
Madam Secretary General, did you do this all in the right order? This is the necessity, this is necessary for us to be at this point and still making that decision, that determination, as compared to earlier in the process?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Why is it that we're now at this point making that market assessment, determining what the market should bear, can bear, as compared to making that determination prior to the beginning of this process we're now at the stage in which I thought we'd be at procurement. We're still at the studying stage of trying to determine what we should purchase.
I actually think we're beyond that. We are going to be buying aircraft to continue the prototyping and experimentation. In the second year of the prototyping and experimentation, we were able to put a fully exportable, low-cost network onto these aircraft so that a tactical air controller on the ground can touch an iPad and it shows up in the cockpit of the aircraft, so that you're communicating among nodes, and we've done it then in a way that doesn't require there's no export controls at all. So I think we've made a lot of progress. I don't think we were ready to make a procurement decision, and we decided in particular we need to get more of our allies and partners involved in this from the get-go, or it may not work.
Thank you both.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein, for being here. Thank you for your service, and thank you to the airmen that you represent service also. So in order to maintain the effectiveness of our nuclear deterrent, it is your job to identify the resources that are required to maintain and modernize those nuclear assets. We've been working with the Air Force for years to secure funding for a new weapons generation facility at Malmstrom. The current facility is deteriorating. Giant cracks in the walls are getting bigger, and I'm sure you know that because of that, deteriorating infrastructure has created numerous safety and logistical and security challenges, and that munitions operations will remain at risk due to inefficiencies and failing infrastructure there at Malmstrom. We're talking about a facility at which ICBM warheads are maintained and stored. So I believe, as I think you do, that there's urgency here. Secretary Wilson, will this project be included in the Air Force 2020 budget request?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, the FY20 budget does include $235 million for the weapons storage facility there at Malmstrom. It's based on the design that we used at F.E. Warren, although there's a few things that are different, including, of course, labor rates there and also soil conditions, so that's a little more expensive, but it's based on the same design.
That's good. And so the construction cost went from $200 million to $235 million. What's the reason for that increase?
Sir, two things. First, the labor rates are different in Montana compared to Wyoming, and the second is there are some differences in the soil.
Yeah.
So we have to do some differences in the construction.
Okay, I've got it. I would have hoped, and this is just a side comment, I would have hoped that the way this is being staggered with Wyoming and then in Montana and North Dakota, that we would gain some efficiencies there. But it doesn't appear that that's the case.
We'll gain some efficiencies by using the same design, or the same basic design, but there are a lot of things that go into cost, and we put $235 million into the budget because we expect that it's going to be more expensive for those two reasons.
So if $3.6 billion across all military construction accounts are reprogrammed, say, for a border wall, then I would imagine this project would be further delayed. Is that fair?
Sir, I don't think this is in the FY20 proposed President's budget.
Yes.
So it is not an item that's already been.
So if money's pulled out of this year's budget, you don't think it would shift 20s down?
The budget that we've put forward, sir, has $235 million for this military construction project.
Okay, and so if money was pulled out of this year's budget for military construction in this line item, it wouldn't shift, we're still in line to have it happen regardless of what happens?
That's my understanding as to how the entire Defense Department budget was put together and presented to you all yesterday,
Okay.
or Monday.
All right, okay. Okay, that's good if it doesn't happen. I would think that if money's not there, it'll be backfilled with the next year's budget. But I could be wrong on that. The Montana Air National Guard is flying some of the oldest C-130s in the Air Force. They're C-130Hs. They have not received all their upgrades. There's issues with this, separate schools, parts availability, additional training requirements for pilots, maintainers, moving from the Js to the Hs. These are all challenges for Guard units flying aircraft that's different from the active duty component. So, not to put you on the spot, but what's your expectations for the 130Js? And since our airplanes at the Montana Air Guard have not received all the updates as others have, would we be in the queue first?
So, I mentioned in the opening statement that I went to Desert Storm. We learned a really valuable lesson at a Desert Storm because I was flying the newest F-16s, and the Birmingham Air National Guard showed up at the same base with us flying the oldest RF-4s.
Yes.
And what we learned when we look across our active Guard team was that we had not outfitted the Guard with the latest technology, and our interoperability suffered as a result.
Bingo.
And so we reversed that coming out of Desert Storm, and that's why you see us now fielding new weapon systems across the active and the Guard. But when we do so, we also take into account that our most experienced maintainers and operators are in the Air National Guard. Very often they come from the active duty to the Air National Guard.
That's right.
And so their ability to be able to manage weapon systems is somewhat different based on their experience levels. So we do have a plan. Right now, there's no additional C-130Js in the budget. We are upgrading the C-130Hs, and if more money were to become available, then C-130Js is something we would definitely look at.
Well, I would think that it would be, and I know you guys have a lot of priorities. We just talked about the missile priorities with the ICBMs. But it would seem to me that this would also be a priority. As we all want a strong force, there's recruitment opportunities from folks that are going out of the active military and going into the Guard. And if, in fact, those folks have to go get retrained to fly a 130H, and we all love Little Rock, doggone it, Bozeman's not here. We all love Little Rock, but the truth is that they might decide, I'm just going to go a different direction then and not stick with it. So I would hope that this could become more of a priority. Thank you guys for what you do. Appreciate it.
Sir, if I could just say again, speak to
Yes.
your folks in Montana and elsewhere flying the C-130. I was the Air Component Commander in Central Command for 2 years.
Yes.
And I never once had to tell one of my joint teammates no when it came to delivering critical supplies or personnel where they were needed. And we did that with the C-130 fleet.
Yeah, I got it. It's a great mission. It's a great mission. I don't need to tell you how old these planes are. Thank you.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up on Senator Tester's point, and a point that you were making, General, for the ICBM fields, they're flying Hueys out there. So, and that's your active duty forces are flying Huey helicopters out to the missile field. So when Senator Tester talks about the importance of both the facilities and the new aircraft for our missileers, you realize it is very important when they're flying aircraft that's far older than the people flying them, far older.
Senator, in fact, I think it was in September or October, we did choose the follow-on aircraft to replace the Hueys. So that decision is made, in the FY20 budget buys 4 replacement test articles in FY20. So we're beginning the replacement of the Huey.
And those aircraft are?
I'm sorry, sir?
And they are what?
I never remember the numbers, so I would.
UH-60Ws, I believe.
What is it?
We'll have to get that for you.
Oh.
UH-60 Blackhawk? Yes,
It's not the 60, but I'll.
Well, that's the right pick.
I'll mess up the number, so I'll get
No,
it
you
to
won't.
sir.
We're going to really miss you. We're disappointed that you're leaving. You've done a phenomenal job, and you're going to be dearly missed. Hopefully, we're going to keep General Goldfein around for a good long while yet, but best wishes to you. But we really appreciate your service, and we'll miss you greatly. You've been tremendous. How are we doing on catching up on the pilot shortage, something we've talked about?
We've actually, in the end of, we look at the numbers at the end of the year. We ended up producing a few more pilots than we anticipated and kind of stopped the slide. Next year in the FY20 budget, we're going to increase the number going through pilot training, and we hope that our continued efforts at pilot retention and support for pilots, trying to reduce the number of 365-day overseas tours, trying to give pilots more control, implementing our new talent management system so people get more say in their next assignment and more control over their lives, that those will help with retention, but we also need to increase production. So it's production, seasoning, and retention. If we continue on this path, producing about 1,500 pilots a year, we think we will close the gap and have the number of pilots we need by FY23-24 timeframe.
Even with the increased commercial airline hiring and so forth?
Yes, sir, we do. And part of it is we are going to have to produce more pilots. So we're going to have to produce about 1,500 pilots a year rather than about 1,100. We can do that in the way that with our current infrastructure. And then we have to really focus on the quality of life, quality of service.
Hey, Senator, I also want to thank you because I've talked a lot about this, which is this is the national shortage of pilots. To do not only military aviation, but also commercial and business aviation. And so we are also doing incentives to get America's youth flying again. Civil Air Patrol, putting money into the junior ROTC, University of North Dakota, other avenues where we're trying to get more pilots produced to be able to fulfill the requirement across the nation. And so I just want to thank you for your work on that.
Well, and that's appreciated, and I think the reason you're starting to make traction is, or get traction, is because you are looking at all these avenues to draw people into the pilot ranks, and I really commend you for it. Arctic mission, how are we doing on reaching out in the Arctic mission?
So we, you may have said that Secretary Wilson and I put out an op-ed on that because the Air Force has got a significant footprint in the Arctic mission, first and foremost in Homeland Defense, and making sure that we have the assets that are up there that will be able to detect the threats and we can protect the homeland. For power projection, you take a look at Alaska. By the time we complete the bed down of F-35s there, it'll be the state with the most number of fifth-gen high-end assets here that can launch as a platform into the Arctic. And it's also about domain awareness. It's about making sure that we have the weather forecasting and make sure we have the space situational awareness. So we are very heavily invested in the Arctic, and we are working right now with our partners, our Arctic partners, Canada, Finland, Norway, Sweden, on an Arctic challenge exercise to ensure that we further advance our military capabilities to protect that region.
Well, in North Dakota, we speak fluent Canadian, so if we can help you, you let us know.
You bet.
The last question I have goes to the nuclear triad. It's incredibly important, and we need to update and modernize it. I'd like your thoughts in that regard.
Mr. Chairman, nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence have helped to keep the peace for over 70 years. And the Air Force has 2 of the 3 legs of the triad, as well as about 75% of nuclear command, control, and communication. Those legs of the triad are in need of modernization, both with the replacement of the Minuteman missile, but also the replacement of the cruise missile. These are systems that are, the Minuteman, the first stage of the Minuteman that's in silos today was built in 1970. So we need to upgrade these systems, and our budget includes the funds for the continued work on the modernization of the nuclear deterrent, as well as the upgrading of the nuclear command, control, and communication.
And the LRSO, incredibly important for the safety of our aircraft fleet and our pilots, right? And as we face more sophisticated air defense systems. Correct?
Yes, sir, and of course, it's all in support of the the STRATCOM commander's mission. And I'll share with you, sir, that Secretary Mattis, when he first came in, from Stanford, had some serious questions about the nuclear enterprise, and then through the process of our going through the nuclear posture review, became an advocate for all 3 legs of the triad. And I'll share with you the same advice I gave him, and then gave recently to Secretary Shanahan. There are 2 things that I would advise in terms of military advice. Number 1, I would never advise us to unilaterally disarm our nuclear enterprise when our adversaries are arming theirs and building more capacity and capability. That makes no sense to me that we would ever go down that path. The second advice is we should never, and I got to be careful here to stay on unclassified terms, but I would never advocate or recommend that we place ourselves in a position we would no longer have a second strike capability, because potential adversaries are calculating whether they could defeat us, and we want there into their calculus that we can always respond no matter what they do. And with the triad, we can.
Thank you. But again, thank you, Madam Secretary, very much.
Thank you, Senator Hogan. Senator Schatz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, I want to echo the praise from this panel. You've been an exemplary Secretary of the Air Force, and we are going to miss you. You've been nonpartisan and bipartisan, easy to work with, on the level. Really appreciate your service. I want to follow up a little bit on what Senator Tester was talking about with respect to the way the MILCON $3.6 billion may be rated for the purpose of constructing a wall on the southern border of the United States. First question I have is, has the Secretary of Defense or anybody else asked you to begin the work of producing a list of projects to delay?
First of all, we don't have a list of projects from Homeland Security that are necessary to support the mission along the border, and we have not identified specific Air Force projects that could be impacted. And of course, as you know, we request our military construction based on priority and military need.
I get that Homeland Security has to ask that they have to initiate a request, and then they have to make a determination about where wall being built would be in furtherance of the mission of the troops on the border. I get that part. After that determination is made, and after there is a funding requirement, there becomes a delta. The assumption is it's going to be $3.6 billion. It may be less, but I think you would be wise to start preparing, as you look at your list of funded but unobligated MILCON projects, to see how you prioritize them and whether or not you can afford to move any of those to the right, to delay or defund. Has that process begun at all?
We have not identified specific Air Force projects that could be impacted.
So that process has not begun?
And I think, you know, the acting Secretary of Defense has asked his colleague at Homeland Security to identify what projects from the Homeland Security perspective are necessary to support the mission.
Right, but that's not the question I'm asking, right?
That would then trigger some guidance, presumably from the Secretary of Defense, that we do some work as services, but we have not identified specific Air Force projects that could be impacted.
Okay, and so I get it. So you haven't done that work yet. And at the time that you do that work, will you be transparent with the Congress with respect to your criteria for moving stuff to the right or defunding or delaying? And will you let us know where you are in the process so that it doesn't become a black box?
Yes.
Thank you. Is the expectation, let's say it's $2 billion that it gets rated from MILCON, is the expectation that the Congress then, quote, backfills the money, in other words, appropriates the money to the same project twice?
I don't know. And I think part of that is we don't know yet what the requirement will be from the Department of Homeland Security and how much we're talking about here, and whether there's other funds that might be reprogrammed. So I just don't know.
It just seems like this is about to be, among other things, a fiscal train wreck, because, right, Senator Tester is talking about his $230 million priority for his home state to safely house ICBMs, as I understand it. That's in the 2020 budget request. So assuming that everything that the Democrats are saying happens to be correct with respect to our inclination to so-called backfill, in other words, to appropriate money twice, then whatever falls off your list, if Tester's project, if everything that's in the 2020 president's budget doesn't fall off the list, then if it falls off the list, it is not actually first in line for the following year. It's really fallen off a cliff. And I guess the question is, among all of the funded but unobligated MILCON projects for the Air Force, is there anything that you see that is not essential for readiness?
We request military construction based on priority and military need. Some of it's readiness, some of it is just straightforward modernization, that you've got to house new aircraft and so forth.
Is there anything
So it
that
is all
you think?
necessary.
Right, and given that the Department of Defense has articulated to us that there's a $100 billion shortfall in MILCON overall, and given that we've always done MILCON on a bipartisan basis, and that whenever you ask for something, we know that it's on the level, my question is very straightforward, which is there anything on your list that you think you don't need?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schott. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a real pleasure to join the committee, working with you and your very capable staff, and Ranking Member Durbin, also very capable staff. That's the great thing about being on these, these subcommittees. It's all about taking care of the military in a very, very bipartisan way, and we certainly appreciate your leadership in that regard. General Goldfein, again, thank you so much for all that you do, and not only now, but have done through your career. Secretary Wilson, it's been a real pleasure serving with you in the House, and now serving with you now in our different capacities. And I know that nobody's worked any harder than you have, and nobody's any more knowledgeable. And we really do appreciate you, again, for the many, many different ways that you've served your country. One of the things I'd like to ask about, I think there is concern about light attack. Secretary Moran, Senator Moran got into that a little bit. I'd like to ask about the situation, despite, a perceived shift. One of the requirements that is continuing to be highlighted is building partner capacity. You mentioned that earlier, and certainly as we've all met, that comes up all the time. Objective in the National Defense Strategy, the Guard State Partnership Program is an existing way we can achieve the critical mission of building partnership capacity. Assuming that we do move forward with light attack at some point, what role do you see the Guard playing, and how can the Air Force take advantage of these existing State Guard partnerships?
Senator, I'll start out, and maybe General Goldfein might want to add. The State Partnership Program is a wonderful program, and probably we don't talk about it enough, and the tremendous difference that it makes. It's a partnership between state guards and countries, and it was started after the fall of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the emergence of new democracies in Eastern Europe, but it is now expanded where there are 70 different state partnership programs. And they have a number of advantages, one of which is that in many countries the military is much more like the National Guard, where it has national defense but also civil society kind of functions, so more similar to the National Guard. But also the relationships are enduring, and people are in the Guard for an entire career, and they create deep relationships of trust with our partners and allies in other air forces. So I think there's tremendous opportunity there with allies and partners generally, whether it's in light attack or in other things. And I will just leave you this one story. The chief and I were in the Middle East, and we went to Jordan and met with the air chief there. And some of you may remember that Jordan has F-16s. And some of you may remember that one of their pilots had ejected over ISIS-occupied territory in Syria and was captured and put in a cage and burned alive, tortured, Jordanian pilot. The Jordanians planned a retaliatory strike. And that retaliatory strike was led by a major in the Colorado National Guard who was on exchange with the Jordanian Air Force. They didn't forget that. And it deepens a partnership that is career-long, very useful.
Sir, I'll just add that, one of the first meetings I had in the opening weeks after becoming chief was at the State Department with the Deputy Secretary of State. And I had a discussion with him about the role of my role as an international air chief when it comes to coalition building and sustainment, and whether there was a special partnership that we needed to have with the State Department, because countries around the world that will join coalitions and offer military capability have the same challenges that we do, offering often sometimes boots on the ground. And if they don't have access to ports, they don't buy navies. But one thing most countries have is an air component to protect their sovereign borders. So therefore, coalitions very often come together first in the air and then stay longest in the air. And so when we look at the strategy of driving violence down across the globe to the point where it can be maintained within its borders, you could see why our strategy with light attack was to build an interoperable network and a variety of capabilities that allow them to join us. And in some ways, for me, it's the air equation of the math on the ground in North Africa. 1,000 Americans plus 4,000 French enables 35,000 fighters to be able to counter violence in North Africa. This is the air component contribution to that.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Baldwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In October, former Secretary of Defense Mattis ordered that the Air Force get to 80% mission-capable rates for its fighters. I'd like to hear from you where the Air Force is at this point in meeting that goal. And since the directive came after you had received your 2019 budget, how much money will it cost this year to meet that goal?
Senator, we are actually, we have identified reprogramming that has to be done within the Air Force budget, particularly for the F-22s and F-16s. And we're focused on the operational squadrons where we measure mission capability rates most directly. I believe that we are probably going to meet that objective with the F-16s. Given the impact of the hurricane on the F-22s and Tyndall Air Force Base and all of the permanent change of station moves associated with moving those F-22s, we may not make it with the F-22s, but we do have to do the reprogramming to get more money into weapon system sustainment for the F-16 and the F-22 within the Air Force budget. The responsibility for the funding for the sustainment of the F-35s goes through the Joint Program Office, and they manage that. I can give you privately and in a secure session the actual numbers of where we are on both mission-capable rates, and also we monitor not just mission-capable rates, are just about whether the airplanes are ready to fly. An airplane sitting in a hangar that's ready to fly is not necessarily ready to fight. And so for us, it's about the readiness of our squadrons to fly and fight that matters.
Okay, so meeting this readiness goal, along with the modernization that we had a chance to discuss earlier, things like the F-16 radar systems, so that they can operate alongside the next generation fighters. It's particularly important in a state like Wisconsin that has F-16s at Truax and is a future site for F-35s. But it's also my understanding that the Air Force has had trouble funding some really basic base operations, road maintenance, garbage collection, basic repair and modernization of facilities on installations, and has embarked on, as I know this committee has discussed earlier, an ambitious plan to replace its missile defense satellites, which also requires increased funding. So I imagine there are more items on the list that I haven't even gotten to, but I'd ask, what are the Air Force's top 2 or 3 readiness gaps that you would like to see addressed?
Ma'am, I would just start by telling you that for the Secretary and I, readiness first and foremost is about people. And so that's why you've seen us in a continual growth of manpower, active guard, reserve, civilian end strength, so we can rebuild the force from that, like we talked about, the 945,000 that we were back in '91 to defeat a rogue nation into the 685,000 we have. So we have to fill our squadrons to make sure that they are capable of fighting formations. We were very successful this year of closing the gap on maintainers. We were 4,000 maintainers short, and we successfully have closed that. Now, our challenge we're working through right now is they're young. And so while we have the numbers we need, now we need to experiencing them. And so we're looking at how we do that more rapidly. You brought up the roads and grounds and making sure that, we are a land-based force, and we fight from our bases. And so therefore, we're putting a significant amount of effort into not only how we sustain those bases, but also bases forward that we would roll in on as the halt force. Because if you look at the combatant commander plans, they expect the air component to be able to arrive first by virtue of the fact that we can fly there quickly, halt enemy activity before we go forward.
I agree that these are really important to address. I'm aware that DOD is only authorized to transfer up to $4 billion annually within its own accounts. And with much of that being planned to be used up by transferring money between accounts to pay for the wall, I'm not sure how all of these gaps and more will be addressed. And so as we're looking to conduct oversight on both readiness funding as well as how DOD is able to move these funds around, could you tell the committee which readiness gaps should be delayed and which ones are not priorities right now?
Senator, the reprogramming that we need, we can give you chapter and verse on what's required in order to meet the mission capable rates that we've been guided to work towards. And I think there is one reprogramming request. I believe that has already come up to the Hill, although it may be just on the verge of coming up here. But we'll be able to explain that in detail. But to meet the guidance that says that we need to get to 80% mission-capable rates, we do have to do reprogramming because the guidance came down in this fiscal year.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Wilson, let me add my voice to those of others who have thanked you for your extraordinary service as Secretary of the Air Force. You truly have done an amazing job on everything from procurement to morale, to recruitment, to readiness. I can't think of anyone better. And I'm very sad that you're leaving. You can still tell them no in El Paso. Maybe you can't. But I just wanted to start off by thanking you and wishing you well. The air refueling wing in Bangor, Maine, which I did not get an opportunity to bring you to visit, so I'm hoping the general will make up for that, has long been a workhorse unit for the Air Force. It typically supports more than 1,000 transient aircraft annually. In addition, it continues to deploy personnel at very high rates worldwide. The wing's enormous workload is demonstrated by the fact that it has processed twice as many gallons of fuel as the average Air National Guard refueling wing. And its strategic location obviously makes it absolutely critical. What are we doing to make sure that a workhorse unit like this refueling wing has the resources it needs at a time when it's still deploying individuals at a great rate? General.
Ma'am, I'll tell you that having been pulled out of a lot of really bad places by some courageous tanker crews, many of which I'm sure are at Bangor, I wouldn't be sitting here had it not been for the courage of those crews. So as we recapitalize the tanker force, I go back to, in a world of pure competition, those 3 phone calls that I will get as chief, the secretary will get, that says the combatant commander, let's say in EUCOM, needs tankers. The STRATCOM commander to be able to support the nuclear mission needs tankers. The NORTHCOM commander to defend the homeland needs tankers. These are simultaneous, no-fail missions. Therein lies why you see the investment in the KC-46 and the sustainment of the tankers that we have so we can get to the 479 required that we will do in 19 to ensure that we have the tanker force required to do the nation's business. And I would just say, I believe that we are a global force, a global power because of global reach, and it's our tankers that give us that.
Senator, if I could just add one brief thing. The study that we did on that was directed by the Congress, that came really from our hearings last year when you all asked us, we always come up and present the Air Force we can afford given the budget that we have. And you asked us, well, what is the Air Force we need to execute the National Defense Strategy? And that led to a piece of work that you all directed that is ready to come up in classified form. But we released an unclassified summary, and it's no big surprise to anyone that the Air Force we need is larger than the Air Force we have. One of the biggest areas of unmet need, particularly by the time we get to the 2025-2030 timeframe, is in tankers.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson, in what seems like a major change of direction, the budget requests new F-15 fighter jets, which haven't been purchased by the Department of Defense since 2001. If you were not constrained by an inadequate budget, would your preference be for more F-35s?
If the budget is unconstrained, there are a lot of things that I can think of that would be
But in terms of capability that the F-35 gives you.
Talk a little bit about this. Or Chief, do you want to lead, or do you want?
I would just say, ma'am, that very often we throw the terms fourth generation and fifth generation around. And if I could just take a couple minutes and explain the importance of what fifth generation means and the F-35's role in that. Because we will sometimes present charts that shows this red dome over a country as though they can put a block of wood over themselves to protect themselves. That's actually not accurate. The best a country can do today is a block of Swiss cheese. There are holes there, and it's our job in the Air Force to know where they are, exploit them, and get in. And when we get in, it's with a penetrating joint team. We're there in space. We're there with high-altitude ISR. We're there with B-21. We're there with F-22. We're there with F-35. We're there with our joint teammates, with submarines. We're there with special operations. If I could send a message to any of our adversaries, whoever sees an F-35, it would be, we're here. Not I'm here, we're here, because the F-35 will never be alone. But what the F-35 brings is not the traditional fighter characteristics that we always think about. It's the information fusion from multiple sources that comes together in the cockpit and allows that F-35 to be the quarterback of the penetrating team. And there's no other weapon system that we've designed that can do that role. And in that role, it's performing spectacularly. Our challenge was that when you look at the force structure that we have, there are 4 fourth-gen airplanes, F-16, F-15E, A-10, and F-15C, that we need to fly into 2030s. The F-15C is not going to make it. It is old and is not going to fly past the mid-20s, and we need that capacity to do all the missions I laid out for you in my opening statement. And so where we find ourselves in a position where we've got to buy 72 aircraft a year to be able to reverse the historical trends, and the F-15C is going to retire. We used the best cost estimate that we had at the time and looked at the various options. And the most affordable option, as long as we keep the F-35 absolutely on track with our program of record, was to look at an F-15 variant to replace the F-15C. And so that's why we are looking at that. It's one line of fourth gen to keep that mix right. But an F-15 will never be an F-35.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some more questions that I'd like to submit for the record, if I may.
Thank you, Senator Collins. You can do that. Senator Udall.
Thank you very much, Chairman Shelby. Secretary Wilson, I would also like to echo what others have said here and thank you for your service to the nation and to the United States Air Force during your distinguished career. And I'd like to congratulate you on your upcoming career opportunity at UTEP. That's still staying close to New Mexico, so I'm sure you'll enjoy that. And we're going to miss your leadership at the Pentagon. Madam Secretary, as you're aware, an epidemic of PFAS contamination is infecting communities adjacent to Air Force bases all over the country, and I know the General is familiar with this too. Families, business owners, farmers, and service members who have suffered from exposure to these toxic chemicals in New Mexico deserve immediate relief, and the Air Force must take precautionary steps to prevent further dangers to public health. In response, myself, Senator Heinrich, and Representative Lujan are pressing the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Defense through the newly introduced legislation to coordinate closely with the state of New Mexico to move forward with remediation plans to clean up contaminated sites and take all necessary steps to prevent further risks to public health. We have made sure to keep the Air Force informed as we've worked on this issue. The Air Force has asserted that it does not have legal authority under the law to provide clean water or filtration for agriculture. Is that your understanding of current authority?
Yes, Senator Luriel, that's correct. We have authority to provide clean water to people, but not for agricultural use under the current law.
And our bill provides that authority. It moves further than you believe you have authority for. Is the Air Force prepared to work with us to find a way to ensure that they have the authority?
Senator, we will work with you on that legislation, and also there's a very broad coalition of people concerned with this issue. And if I could, because it affects them, what we're talking about here is a chemical that was safe for its intended use at the time it was used. It's called PFOS and PFOA, and it was used in firefighting foam, but it was by the Air Force. But at less than 3% of this chemical was sold to firefighting foam companies. It's used in wrappers on fast food. It's used for waterproofing on shoes. It's used in Teflon coating on pans. So it's used in a lot of different things, and it is now an emerging potential pollutant. And the Air Force leaned forward and identified, looked at all of our sites as to where it might be, and began the process of assessing whether there was any impact to the water and taking mitigating actions. So I think all the services really leaned forward and did that, and I think it was the responsible thing to do. But we also need to recognize this is a national issue and problem, and probably is going to involve not just the EPA and Department of Defense, but agriculture, health and human services. This is a major issue for the country, of which the Air Force is just one small piece.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, I mean, this is a toxic chemical, and what happened in New Mexico near Cannon is with the firefighting activities, the PFOS chemical with large quantities of this has polluted the aquifer. It's poisoned people. I have a farmer that's gone and taken specifically from his blood and from the wife of his blood to see. They have very high levels of PFOS in their blood. He's about ready to kill 4,000 cows because he has no way through filtration, which I asked you about. The cows, he cannot sell them. It could impact an even larger area, which is all dairy farmers. So we're at the point of the spear on this. I mean, New Mexico and this base, you've poisoned people, you've poisoned agriculture, you've poisoned the aquifer, and you've poisoned the feed that's raised for the farmers also has PFOS. So we would hope that you would be very, very aggressive about dealing with this issue. We've been very frustrated with dealing with the Air Force on this because you say you had wanted to have the authority. We gave you legislation on November 27th. Your response, which I'd ask that response be put in the record. Consent to do that, Mr. Chairman? Response be put in the record.
Without objection.
You basically responded with something that wasn't very helpful and basically says we don't want to have the authority to do that. We sent revisions back to you on February 14th, and so March the 6th we introduced our bill. So our sense is the Air Force is not moving aggressively like it should be moving, and I'd like to know whether you believe that you're going to take the authority and get the bull by the horns. And you say here you want to have authority. Well, support the bill. Will you support our bill? Tell me today, will you support our bill so that we can move forward and correct these things? General, why don't you start?
Senator, we have dozens of sites around the country where this is an issue. It is a particular issue at Cannon where we not only, we have the authority to provide clean water immediately and also prevent any additional damage to the aquifer when it has to do with people. We do not have the authority to deal with agriculture. To his credit, our Assistant Secretary for Installations and Environment has led the effort in the executive branch to engage the Secretary of Agriculture, the EPA, and Health and Human Services to see whether they have authorities to be able to deal with the agriculture issues. And as you know, and all of us have been concerned and frustrated by this, that there is no standard for agriculture as well. So it's an extremely difficult situation. We are doing the best we can with the authorities that we have, but it is a national problem. And there is a coalition of members, some of whom are on this committee as well, who are facing this issue.
Well, have you all reviewed our legislation, and will you support it?
Senator, I have not seen your draft legislation.
Okay. Well, we've been sharing it with you over the course of 3 months, and I think you knew this was what I was going to ask about. So I'm very disappointed as to where we are today, and we can put it in all sorts of fancy words, but the reality is of this one farmer and many farmers that are in the region is the Air Force has poisoned his family, they poisoned his livestock, they poisoned his water, and they poisoned his crops. And we would expect under those circumstances that the Air Force be very aggressive about supporting legislation and doing all you can to make sure this contamination doesn't spread further and to take care and make the people whole that have been hurt already. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. And Secretary, let me join everybody else in telling you how much we appreciate the leadership you've shown, the work you've done, and our long friendship over 20 years now has really always been important to me. I've always had great confidence in the decisions you would make in any job, and particularly in this job. I'm going to come back to you in a minute and ask a little bit about military families, things like the Military Family Flexibility Act, the importance of military families as it relates to that highly skilled technical workforce that you have in the Air Force today. Let me ask a couple of follow-up equipment questions to General Goldfein. On the F-15 issue, really two questions. One is the F-15 as a complement to the F-35 in the future, in the current and even foreseeable future flying package. And then the other one, you mentioned a variation of the F-15. Was that the F-15EX? Or, yes, sir. So you want to talk about that just a little bit more?
Yes, sir. You know, I would say that the F-15, like all the fourth generation standoff bomber, any standoff capability is complementary to that which is capable of penetrating. And so we look at it from a network team approach, and the future of warfare. And I can't overemphasize the importance of this. It's why we took on the Joint STARS to Advanced Battle Management System debate last year, and why this was so important. Because this is about the future of warfighting and how we move into a network-centric approach as opposed to a platform-centric approach. So it's, again, why the F-35 doesn't fly alone, the F-15 doesn't fly alone. They always fly as part of a joint family and with allies and partners. So complementary, yes. But it's more than just the F-15 and the F-35.
And what does the F-15EX add to the F-15?
What it does in terms of cost is when we looked at, again, the cost estimates that came from CAPE, when we were looking at the requirement for us to buy capacity to do all the missions that we were required to do, and they look at the overall cost. You got to look at the cost of not only the procurement, but the cost of operating over time. And when we looked at the overall operating costs, the F-15, you also got to look at the conversion costs if you go from a F-15C to a different kind of airplane versus an F-15C to a like model airplane where 90% of the parts are common, where you can do local training for the operators and maintenance, and it's about a $10 million conversion costs for aircraft that we can't fly any longer. So that's part of the cost that was put into the equation. The previous question was about combat capability, and that's why I wanted to stress that when it comes to the combat capability of the F-35 and the F-15 will never be the F-35. It wasn't designed to be.
And doesn't cost nearly as much.
Based on the best cost estimates that we had at the time, it doesn't cost as much over the lifetime of the weapon system. And we have been very clear with both the Joint Program Office and the company that we have got to drive the operating costs of the F-35 down. And so were those numbers to change, then we would have to relook at.
Thank you, General. I'm going to have a couple of questions for the record on equipment, particularly C-130s at Rosecrans. But let's talk a little about military families and what we can do and are doing to make them more appreciated in the package that the military serving person puts together.
Senator, there's a couple of things that all three service secretaries sent a letter to the governors talking about the things that matter to our families. And if you ask airmen what really matters to you most, you know, they will go anywhere, do anything, as long as their families are taken care of. And one of those things where we need help from local communities and from states is the quality of the public schools near the bases where we're stationed. And a second is reciprocity of licensure for family members who are assigned in your state. So, and that's a tough one because it's, you know, there's all kinds of boards and commissions over the realtors and the bankers and the lawyers and the cosmetologists, and we understand that. But if you move from Massachusetts to Missouri and you're a family therapist and you have to wait 18 months to get certified in Missouri, then it's a real problem. So those two things can really make your state a base of preference if we can have great public schools and reciprocity of licensure for family members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, I want to add my congratulations or condolences in your new job. No, congratulations. Although we're going to miss you, and I think they're very fortunate to have you down there. Yes, and you and General Goldfein, I really appreciate the time you spent with me at the Capitol the other day. Mr. Chairman, you know, that modest office I have there in the Capitol, we spent some time going over the problems of the world. We have. And in fact, I bragged about your work when they were there. You know, Madam Secretary, we talked before about cybersecurity. I'm more concerned about suddenly all our power grids closed down. We don't know who did it than I am about a missile being fired. This missile comes with a return address. And I think anybody firing a missile knows that wherever it comes from is going to be obliterated in a matter of minutes. But cybersecurity and the commercial side, the defense side, closed down our power grid in the middle of January in the Northeast, things like that, and we don't know where it came from. And I know you have worked hard to get cyber specialists, but then you have to work hard to retain them. And this may sound parochial, and it is, but Norwich University in Vermont is a senior military college. It's the oldest private military college. They have an extensive cyber program. One of the most popular is the Air Force specialty codes among cadets that go into the Air Force. And that's second only to flying. So do you agree that whether it's in Vermont or anywhere else, colleges and universities like Norwich can give the Air Force the ability to recruit based on what they've done?
Senator Norris is a good example of that, of where we're trying to partner with universities and communities to develop cyber talent through our universities and then benefit from it. One of the other things, and I think your folks at Norwich will probably talk to you a little about it, we are actually expanding our language-enabled airmen's program to include not just the ability to speak Spanish or Tagalog or something, but also to include computer languages, and recognizing that as a special skill that we can compensate our airmen for, just like we compensate them for a second foreign language, if you will.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. That's helpful, and wherever it is, these young people, one, they get the skills, but secondly, they learn that being in our military can be something well worthwhile. And General Goldfein, we talked about the Vermont National Guard, the Air Guard. The F-35 is arriving in Burlington this fall. It's a lot different than any aircraft that's been flown up there, certainly, or anywhere else. It's connectivity, it's use of data. They're going to need considerable training. How do you determine what kind of funding goes to a guard unit with a new aircraft like that because of the training, because of all the cyber background?
So there's a process we go through that's a formal basing process that looks at and actually scores against the costs associated with bedding down a new weapon system, and so that was done, and obviously Burlington scored very well, which is why we're bringing the F-35 there. So those costs are all are factored into the bed down, and then we roll them into our normal training pipeline to ensure that we're bringing that capability to bear. You know, it was I think you and I discussed that the unit we're talking about, 24 hours after they deployed to Iraq, were dropping bombs on the enemy, and had one of our top records for the amount of munitions expended during their time frame. So that's a hell of a unit, and I'm looking forward to seeing them get the F-35.
Thank you. They believe when we say service, that it means service.
Yep.
And lastly, I would look carefully at $42 billion your budget is designated as OCO. It's triple last year's level. I would urge you, and we can talk about this more, but try to wean off OCO. It's a gimmick, and it makes it difficult for those of us who are really trying to get a solid budget. But thank you for what you said, and yes, General.
Sir, if I could perhaps just use a moment to speak to our Guard Reserve cyber airmen, because you brought out a great point in terms of how we retain talent. There's a great story that General John Hayden tells. He pulled into a parking spot up in Joint Base Lewis McChord, and a young airman, senior airman in a Tesla, pulled up next to him. And he called him out and he says, hey, airman, come over here. He says, so you have your parents' car, or what you got here? He says, oh, no, sir. He said, this is my car. He said, well, how does an airman afford a Tesla? He said, well, I'm doing my weekend drill duty, but when I don't do this, I'm one of the directors of security at Google. And so one might ask the question, why would someone who has that kind of income put on a uniform of the United States Air Force and come to work on a weekend? And his answer is because he wants to make a difference. And that's what we offer. And so to all those out there who are in the cyber business, we have a place for you.
Thank you, General. Makes me proud, and I know that must have made you proud. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and General. Thank you for your service, your leadership. You're clearly making a difference. And to you, Secretary Wilson, just my deep and genuine thanks for your leadership, for your voice of reason and calmness, and just professionalism throughout. What you have added to this administration is greatly, greatly appreciated and will be deeply missed. I think it's great to have all of us saying this. I do wish that we could influence the decision, but respect that the decision that you have made, but your contribution is just greatly and deeply appreciated. Thank you so very much. And I thank you for the conversation that we had in my office last week. My opportunity to share some of the issues and concerns that I had. You heard me out on my concerns with the Space Force, and we had some discussion about the F-35s. I appreciate, General Goldfein, your explanation here as to how the F-15, fourth generation F-35, your Swiss cheese analogy, kind of helps somebody like me appreciate where this might fit in, because I have been concerned that this might be a dilution of the support towards this fifth generation fleet with our F-35s. So I appreciate that. And I also thank you, Secretary, so much for your continued reminder that we can do so much more from the state's perspective to assist our airmen and their families with a focus on schools and what we do with the licensure. We're making a little bit of headway on the licensure side of that in my state, but it's a great reminder for all of us, because it's these differences that do keep our families in the Air Force, in our services, and there, and so it is appreciated. I wanted to speak to Jay Park, as well as the efforts that we have with training. And I note with some appreciation that the posture statement that you presented this morning identifies Jay Park as one of the regions that's going to receive the targeted funding. I think we recognize the extraordinary asset that we have with that training range up north. The posture statement also speaks to the need to build additional capacity with adversary air. With the aggressor, I understand that the current fleet of 18 primary assigned F-16 aggressor aircraft at Eielson is insufficient. We've had a chance to talk a little bit about this, Madam Secretary. So I'm told that an additional 6 F-16s are immediately needed to support the aggressor mission, and that more can be useful or needed. So the question to both of you this morning is, with regards to the need for additional support on the aggressor squadron, can the Air Force fulfill this requirement? I think we recognize that when we have this extraordinary training capacity up there, that the ultimate training is when you can get that hands-on in the air with the actual aggressor. So broadly to the issue of Jay Park, but more specific to the adequacy of the aggressors.
Yes, ma'am. You know, it's something we don't talk about a lot in terms of Jay Park, but you know this, is that very often we have international partners who either can't get into Nellis for our red flag or prefer to do something a little bit lower visibility. And so they can go in and they can fly on this incredible range, one of the largest ranges we have at Jay Park. So we do have money in the budget, $8 million, to upgrade the threats simulators as we go forward. And it's one of it's our premier range for doing that. When it comes to aggressors, we're actually short on aggressors, both at local training, home station, and in our two large range areas, both Nellis Air Force Base and up at Jay Park in Alaska. The way that we're getting after it is a combination of what we call organic, the F-16s that we own, and contract adversary air. And there are more and more companies that are getting in the business of providing contract air. We're also working with the Navy that uses that as well. So I think what you're going to see is us continuing to push for this right combination, the sweet spot between contract and organic, to get at the adversary air issue.
If I could just add, one of the things, I was out in Utah at Hill Air Force Base, and of course I flew with the aggressors to see Jay Park when I was up in Alaska. But one of the things that the F-35 pilots mentioned to me was it would really help their training and readiness to have to reduce the requirement to fly adversary air. So we're using U.S. pilots to study adversary tactics and pretend to be the bad guys, when maybe we can do that with contractors, so that our pilots who really would go in to fight for the United States can focus on practicing their skills rather than just imitating an adversary. And I thought that was a good point, and it's the reason why we're shifting to see whether we can do more contracted adversary air.
Great, I appreciate that. I know Senator Baldwin wanted to ask one more question. Let me just very quickly ask, and you responded to Senator Hovind's question about the Arctic, and you mentioned the Arctic Challenge exercise that will involve Alaska, Canada, Sweden. Obviously, these exercises are critically important. I always ask the question at any of these appropriations hearings to just ensure that we're keeping our eyes on the Arctic. And sometimes it seems that the Air Force in Alaska is more Pacific-facing than Arctic-facing. And so when you say what you have shared today, that is comforting, it's good, it's necessary. But it's one thing to do the training exercises. It's another thing to make sure that we are making the kinds of investments that we need to address the emerging defense challenges in the Arctic, recognizing that it is just a different environment up there. Are you satisfied with where we are?
Ma'am, I'm satisfied, but I will tell you that this is an opportunity to highlight the important partnership we have with Canada in NORAD, and we defend our homeland together, just as we have for 6 decades. And so as Canada modernizes and we modernize, us being able to be interoperable in both 5th generation and 4th generation is absolutely essential as we go forward.
Yeah. Madam Secretary?
I would just say one of the things that people think about the Arctic strategy from a naval point of view, that and of course the Navy is ship-based, but the majority of Defense Department infrastructure in the Arctic is United States Air Force, and we have to know the domain. So that is about the kind of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions there, the missile warning missions, which are really focused about the threat that could, and historically, that's where we put the ballistic missile early warning radars, because of the threat coming potentially from that direction. So there's been a number of upgrades that we've done there, both at Clear Alaska and also at Thule. And the deepening partnership with our allies who are Arctic allies, the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Finland, and of course Canada, are going to be invaluable going forward.
Well, we appreciate the eye on the Arctic because we know it is being viewed by others, perhaps in a different lens, and we need to be ever aware. So again, thank you both. I will turn to Senator Baldwin for an additional question.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson, I too want to add my words of thanks for your service and that we will miss you. And I have enjoyed our work together since our days on the Energy and Commerce Committee back in the House of Representatives through to your service as Secretary of the Air Force. I don't know if anyone else on the committee has covered Space Force yet, but I did want to ask a couple of questions. I know that the Department of Defense and the Air Force have spent a great deal of energy responding to the President's direction for the creation of a Space Force, and I'm going to withhold judgment until I see the proposal sent over by DOD. But one thing I don't have to withhold judgment on is one thing that I hope we all agree on, that the Air Force ought to be working on lowering the cost of access to space and space launch. So I have a couple of questions along those lines. The Air Force buys launch as a service. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And even though launch is bought as a service, the Air Force still invests in advancing the state of art of rocket propulsion technology. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And to break the habit of using Russian engines, the Air Force has invested considerably over the last decade to mature and advance American-made Stage 1 engine technology?
Correct.
Okay. What has the Air Force done to advance Stage 2, also called upper stage engine technology.
Probably have to get back to you on specifics on upper stage.
Okay, and as you get back to me on that, I am wanting to be made more aware of the progress being made by the Air Force Research Laboratories Rocket Propulsion Directorate, and I would appreciate learning what's happening there, because this committee has appropriated additional funding in recent years to support the AFRL's efforts, and we certainly want to be looking at the results of those efforts as we appropriate for
Absolutely.
fiscal year 2020.
Very happy to. And one of the things we are doing in space is, and I think we've benefited more in space than in any other element of our mission in trying to drive acquisition faster and smarter. And we have a space enterprise consortium out of the Space and Missile Systems Center in California that has now, I think, 274 companies in it. About 3/4 of them are highly innovative companies that have not done business traditionally with the Defense Department. And our average time to get a contract from request for proposal to contract award is 90 days in the consortium. So we are driving forward very aggressively to buy things faster and smarter and leverage commercial space. Chief, did you want to?
Yes, ma'am. I want to just give you perhaps a minute on a warfighter's perspective on space and where we're headed. So from 2011 through 2013, I was deployed forward as the Air Component Commander in Central Command, and one of my responsibilities was to be the Space Coordinating Authority. And so my job was to ensure that I understood all the space capabilities that were available to be able to apply them against an active campaign there in Central Command. And I want to give the administration credit because during that time frame, I could not say the word space and warfighting in the same sentence. Today, based on the President's declaration that space is a warfighting domain, and it's not good enough for us just to be there, we have to dominate, we're having an active dialogue, a very healthy discussion about space as a warfighting domain. And the Secretary laid out the problem statement. I would offer going forward that there are 3 lines of effort that we are working on. Number one, we have to defend what we have in space because it's going to be there for a while and we all depend on it. But number 2, it's not good enough just to step into the ring and take hits. At some point, you got to be able to punch back. And so we've got to be able to develop that capability and field it quickly so we stay ahead of the adversary. And the third piece that we've got to make sure we stay focused on is building the force that can fight and win. Because space has been a benign domain, and so we've got a lot of efforts going forward in the Air Force to ensure that we are developing the cadre of space warriors to be able to do what the nation requires us to do. So from a warfighter perspective, the most important action going forward that I hope we can do this year is to stand up a combatant commander for space, because it normalizes space warfighting for us, and we as a department then know how to act.
Thank you, Senator. So if there are no more questions for the witnesses, we thank you both. We appreciate your appearance before the committee. Senators will have an additional, well, it doesn't say how long they can submit additional written questions, but when those are submitted, we would ask that you respond to them within 30 days. The Defense Committee will reconvene on Wednesday, March 27th at 10 a.m. to receive testimony from the Army. And until then, the subcommittee will stand in recess. Thank you both very, very much.